Hello, my dear listeners. Before we begin the story, I'd like to make a quick announcement. Since YouTube no longer monetizes the type of content I create, I'm moving to Patreon. There are already more than 1,000 stories available there. And now let's begin. The brass scale was upright. Draco stopped with one hand still gripping the warped wooden edge of the vanishing cabinet, his thumb pressed into a splinter that had worked through his glove. The cabinet gave off its usual smells of old varnish, dust, and something faintly metallic from the fittings he had spent weeks examining piece by piece. But the scale beside his left shoe was wrong. He had placed it on the floor himself during his previous visit, tilted against a broken chair leg at an angle ugly enough that he could not possibly forget it. Now its little pans hung evenly, one on either side, motionless beneath a tarnished beam. Draco slowly removed his hand from the cabinet and looked around the room of requirement without moving his feet. Nothing else announced itself. Mountains of discarded desks, cracked wardrobes, cages, trunks, rolled carpets, broken instruments and abandoned school rubbish crowded the enormous chamber until the far end vanished among crooked aisles. Dust lay over everything in dull gray skins, disturbed where Draco had made his regular path toward the cabinet. His breathing sounded embarrassingly loud against the clutter, and he clenched his jaw until the muscles beside his ears hurt. He had not left the scale upright. That was not a guess, and it was not the sort of thing he could afford to dismiss because he was tired. He crouched and picked it up by the central stem. The brass was cold enough to sting his fingertips through the thin fabric of his glove, and a stripe of clean metal showed where his fingers had polished it during the weeks he had been using it as a marker. Draco turned it over. Dust had collected beneath the base, except for a narrow crescent along one side, proving that its position had changed since he last set it down. Someone had touched it or something had knocked it, though there were no footprints crossing his own track through the dirt. Brilliant, he muttered and lowered the scale carefully onto his knee. He disliked the sound of his own voice in the cavernous room. It came back flattened and small from piles of forgotten furniture. His first instinct was to draw his wand and begin searching, but he stopped with his fingers halfway into his robes. Wand out meant fear, and fear made people rush. His father had made that mistake often enough during the past year, speaking too quickly, trusting the wrong people, and finally ending in Azkaban while everyone who had once bowed to Lucius Malfoy suddenly discovered pressing business elsewhere. Draco set the scale down exactly where he remembered leaving it and pressed the chair leg against the base. He leaned close enough to see the line where brass met stone, then dragged one fingernail through the dust in a shallow arc around it. If anyone moved it again, the mark would break. It was a childish trick, almost insulting in its simplicity. But childish tricks worked when people expected complicated magic. He straightened and rubbed the dust from his glove against his trousers, leaving a gray smear across the black cloth. The vanishing cabinet stood open behind him, one door hanging a fraction lower than the other. Draco turned to it and ran his hand along the inner panel, feeling every split in the wood. He had repaired enough to know the problem was not one single break that could be mended with a neat incantation. The cabinet had been damaged years ago, and its connection to the matching cabinet in Borgin and Burke's behaved unpredictably. Sometimes an object sent through vanished and did not return. Sometimes sound carried badly, sometimes nothing happened at all, and Draco had to begin again with another adjustment while remembering that failure here did not mean detention or humiliation. Failure meant his mother. He pushed that thought away and reached behind the cabinet to check his second marker. A chipped blue teacup sat upside down on a low crate where he had deliberately placed it with its handle pointing toward the cabinet door. The handle still pointed correctly. Draco touched the rim, then checked the dust beneath it without shifting the cup. No clean scrape marked the crate, and the thin cobweb between the handle and a bent metal candlestick remained unbroken. That should have reassured him. Instead, it made the scale worse. If some wandering object inside the room had struck the scale, why had nothing else near it moved? If another student had discovered the cabinet, why straighten one worthless piece of brass and leave everything else untouched? Draco lifted his wand at last, not dramatically but close to his thigh, and began walking around the immediate area. His shoes ground grit and splinters into the stone floor while he checked gaps behind wardrobes, underneath tables, and between towers of discarded furniture large enough to conceal a person. Nobody answered his movement. No robe brushed wood. No breath caught behind the heaps. Draco found a nest of dead beetles beneath a desk, a cracked bottle with something black dried around its neck, and an old moth-eaten school scarf stuffed into a drawer, but no watcher. By the time he returned to the cabinet, the skin between his shoulders felt damp beneath his shirt from the stale warmth of the room. He did not like mysteries unless he was the one creating them. Draco slipped his wand away and pulled a small roll of parchment from his pocket. He had begun recording the cabinet's failures in cramped shorthand because he could no longer trust himself to remember every adjustment, and the parchment now contained columns of symbols. Nobody else would understand at a glance. He added a short mark beside that morning's entry, then stopped. Writing that someone might have found the room would be monumentally stupid if the parchment were ever taken from him. He tore off the bottom inch instead. The ripping sound seemed enormous. Draco folded the strip twice, placed it beneath the brass scale, and tilted the scale back against the chair leg until only the thinnest corner of parchment remained visible. If the scale shifted, the paper would either move or crumple. He then took the chipped teacup and rotated its handle a quarter turn away from the cabinet, making the change deliberately different from the first marker. 2 objects, 2 tests, neither important enough to attract attention unless someone was specifically watching his habits. He moved to the cabinet and shut its doors. The warped wood resisted until he leaned his shoulder into it, and the latch clicked with a dry metal snap. Draco kept his palm against the door for another moment, feeling the uneven surface through his glove. He had come here to work on the connection to Borgin and Burke's, but he was no longer prepared to touch anything important until he understood whether someone had been close enough to see it. A noise came from somewhere behind the towers of junk. Draco spun, wand already in his hand. The sound came again, a dull scrape, followed by a clatter of wood striking stone. Draco stepped sideways rather than forward, putting the cabinet behind his body. "Who's there?" he called, keeping his voice low despite the sudden hammering of his pulse. Nothing answered, but the scraping continued for another second before stopping with a soft thump. He moved toward it carefully, his wand aimed between 2 leaning wardrobes. The passage narrowed until his shoulder brushed, dusty cloth hanging from broken screen, and the fabric left a chalky streak across his sleeve. Something shifted ahead. Draco raised his wand higher and rounded the wardrobe in one sharp movement. A wooden mannequin lay on its side. One arm had come loose and rolled against the leg of a table. Draco stared at it, furious at the heat in his face, then crouched and examined the place where it had stood. The base rested on a warped board that had finally split under its weight. No footprints surrounded it. No person could have knocked it down without leaving some sign in the heavy dust. He shoved the loose arm aside harder than necessary and walked back toward the cabinet. The brass scale was no longer leaning against the chair. It stood upright again. Draco stopped so abruptly that the sole of his shoe slid half an inch through the dust. The strip of parchment he had folded beneath the base now lay beside it, flattened cleanly against the floor. The teacup remained exactly where he had turned it, its handle still pointing away from the cabinet. Draco approached the scale without blinking, lowered himself to one knee, and stared at the broken arc his fingernail had drawn through the dust. The line had been cut by the base. Someone had moved it while he was less than 30 yards away. Draco picked up the parchment strip and crushed it inside his fist. Whatever had touched the scale had done so deliberately, choosing the same object twice while leaving the second marker untouched. That was not accident, and it was not the room shifting its contents around him. Someone knew which object Draco cared about. He closed his fingers until the parchment dug into his palm. Then he lifted the brass scale, carried it to the vanishing cabinet, and locked it inside. From that moment, the scale was no longer a warning. It was bait. Crab had pumpkin juice on his cuff. Draco noticed it before either of them spoke. A sticky orange stain darkening the edge of the heavy Slytherin robe, where Crab had wiped his mouth instead of using a napkin. Goyle sat beside him on the leather sofa, with one knee spread into the aisle, chewing something that cracked between his teeth. The common room smelled of damp stone, coal smoke, wool that had not dried properly, and the remains of supper being carried in on people's clothes. Draco lowered himself into the chair opposite them and placed a packet of exploding snap cards on the table, as though that were why he had called them over. "Play," he said, sliding the cards toward Goyle with 2 fingers. Goyle looked disappointed that the meeting was apparently ordinary, but he shuffled the pack badly and dealt 3 cards face up before Crab reminded him that they were supposed to be hidden. Draco watched both of them instead of the game. Their faces were easier to read when they were occupied, especially Crab's, because concentration pulled his mouth open slightly and made lying difficult. The first card burst with a crack against Goyle's thumb. He swore and shook his hand while Draco picked a speck of singed paper from the table. "Yesterday," Draco said casually, "when you were outside the 4th floor corridor. How long were you there?" Crab frowned at his cards. "Dunno. 20 minutes. Draco placed another card down. 35. Crab's eyes lifted, confused. "Was it?" "I asked how long you were there, not whether you can count." Goyle snorted, then stopped when Draco looked at him. Draco rested his forearm against the chair and let the next silence stretch until Crab began shifting his boots against the rug. Neither boy understood why the question mattered, which made their answers more useful. "Who passed?" Draco asked. "Loads," Crab replied. "Students, that bloke from Ravenclaw, Filch." Goyle chewed the inside of his cheek. "Potter." Draco's fingers stopped above the next card. What about Potter? Goyle glanced at Crab, a movement small enough that most people would have missed it. Draco did not. Crab scratched the orange stain on his cuff with one blunt fingernail and said, "Nothing?" Draco placed his card down without turning it over. You've just looked at each other like two first-years caught stealing treacle tart. Try again. The fire gave a dull pop behind him as a piece of coal split. Around them, other Slytherins talked over homework, Quidditch, Slughorn's latest invitations, and the continuing gossip about Katie Bell. But none were close enough to hear without making it obvious. Draco shifted the card packet nearer his elbow and lowered his voice. Did Potter speak to you? Crab said no too quickly. Goyle, less competent at deciding when silence was required, said, Only asked where we were going. Draco's expression did not change. When? Goyle looked miserable now. A couple of days ago. He rubbed the burned patch on his thumb against his trouser leg. Near the stairs, he asked why we kept hanging about corridors. Draco tapped one knuckle against the tabletop once. And what did you tell him? Crab leaned forward. Nothing important. Said we were waiting for you. The card beneath Draco's hand detonated. A bright orange flash spat sparks over his sleeve, and he jerked his arm back before the heat reached his skin. Several people nearby laughed, assuming he had simply lost a round. Draco brushed charred scraps from his robe and forced himself to look bored. You told Potter you were waiting for me. Crab's face sagged. He already knows we're mates. That isn't remotely the point. Goyle reached for another card. Draco caught his wrist before he touched it and pushed the hand back to the table. What else? He asked. Think properly this time. Goyle's brow knotted. He asked why we were always in different places. Draco felt something hard settle beneath his ribs. Different places? Yeah. Crab nodded, eager to prove useful. He said sometimes we were by the 7th floor, sometimes the stairs, sometimes near that old classroom. Draco stared at them. The brass scale inside the cabinet returned to him not as an image, but as a fact. Someone had known which object mattered. That still did not fit Potter. Potter could follow people badly, glare across corridors, make accusations without proof, and convince himself that suspicion counted as evidence. But he could not enter the room simply by knowing Draco used the 7th floor. Yet if Crab and Goyle had been answering questions for days, Potter might know more than Draco had assumed. What exactly did you say about the 7th floor? Draco asked. Crab began scratching his neck. Nothing? Draco leaned forward until the chair leather creaked beneath him. You have used that word 3 times tonight, and every time it has meant something? Crab swallowed. I said we'd been waiting near the tapestry sometimes. For one moment, Draco heard every sound in the room separately. Metal poker against grate, parchment being folded, a goblet touching stone, somebody coughing near the dormitory stairs. He kept his face still because losing control in front of these two would make them defensive, and defensive people remembered badly. Which tapestry? Crab's mouth opened. Goyle answered instead. The dancing bloke with the trolls. Draco sat back. That was worse. He turned one exploding snap card between his fingers, careful not to bend it. Crab and Goyle did not know what the tapestry meant. To them it was merely a landmark. Potter, however, had spent enough years prowling Hogwarts after curfew to recognize the 7th floor corridor as somewhere worth watching. even if he did not yet understand why. Draco's old method had depended on people overlooking patterns because the individual pieces were meaningless. Crab had started connecting them for Potter. "Did Potter ever ask what I was carrying?" Draco said. This time both boys hesitated. Draco's voice sharpened. "Answer." "A book once," Goyle muttered, "and a parcel." Crab added, "And he asked why you kept changing your bag." Draco's grip tightened on the card. He'd changed bags twice because the cabinet notes were easier to hide in different compartments, and because one strap had developed a tear. Potter had noticed something Draco himself had considered trivial. "What did you tell him about the parcel?" Crab shrugged. "Said it was yours." Draco shut his eyes for half a second. That answer at least was useless. The problem was not what they had revealed deliberately. It was the shape left by everything they had revealed without understanding it. Where Draco went, how often he changed routes, what he carried, which corridors required lookouts. Potter did not need the whole secret if he could learn the edges of it. Draco gathered the cards into a neat stack. "From now on, if Potter asks where I am, you don't know." Goyle nodded immediately. "If he asks where you're going to the kitchens." Crab smiled slightly. "All the time?" "No, idiot, that would become a pattern." Draco slid the deck back into its packet. "You alternate. Kitchens, library, owlery, Quidditch stores. Say something ordinary and don't use the same answer twice in succession." Crab looked offended by the amount of remembering involved. "Why?" Draco gave him a flat look. "Because I'm asking you to?" Neither argued after that. He stood and straightened the front of his robe, then changed his mind and sat again before they could move. The room's greenish light from the lake pressed against the narrow windows, turning passing shadows outside into vague movements across the stone. Draco took a silver sickle from his pocket and placed it on the table. "Tomorrow?" he said. "Goyle, you carry this." Goyle picked up the coin. "Why?" "You keep it in your left pocket. Don't spend it, don't show it to anyone, and don't move it unless I tell you." Draco turned toward Crab. "You carry nothing unusual. You both wait outside the Transfiguration corridor after lunch." Crab frowned. "But you don't go there." "I'm aware." That earned a silence. Draco let it settle before continuing. "If Potter follows you, you take the west stairs. If he doesn't, you come straight back here. You do not look behind you. You do not whisper. You do not suddenly start acting like spies because Potter will notice before you've taken 10 steps. Goyle rolled the sickle across his knuckles and nearly dropped it. Draco snatched it back before it struck the floor, pressed it into Goyle's palm, and closed the boy's fingers around it. And try not to lose the only part of this plan that requires no intelligence. Crab laughed. Goyle shoved him with one shoulder. Their irritation reassured Draco more than obedience would have. Irritated people behaved normally. He dismissed them with a nod, but neither had taken 3 steps before Draco called them back. Crab turned with a groan. Draco lifted the packet of cards and pointed it at him. "One last thing. Did Potter ever touch either of you?" The question wiped the amusement from Crab's face. "Touch us? Your robes, your bags, anything." Goyle looked at Crab again. This time the glance was enough. Crab said, "He bumped me." Draco lowered the cards. "Where?" "Near the library last week." Crab rubbed his side as though remembering the impact. He was coming around the corner, hit my shoulder, said sorry. Potter rarely said sorry to Draco's friends. Draco rose slowly and crossed to Crab before the boy could object. He grabbed the front of Crab's robe, pulled the fabric toward the common room light, and examined the seams. Crab smelled faintly of gravy and smoke. Nothing obvious showed on the black wool, but inside the outer fold, near the pocket, Draco found several pale fibers clinging where they should not have been. He pinched one free, fine wool, gray, not enough to prove anything, enough to change the game. Draco released Crab's robe and handed the fiber back as though it were rubbish. "Tomorrow's plan changes," he said. "You're not avoiding Potter." Crab blinked. "You're going to let him follow you." Goyle stopped rolling the sickle. Draco took the coin from him again and tucked it into Crab's left pocket instead. Then he pressed the fabric flat over it and stepped away. "If Potter wants a pattern," Draco said, "we'll give him one." The classroom had not been used in years, but somebody had left 3 desks upright among the rest. Draco dragged the nearest one 6 inches toward the wall, letting the wooden legs rasp across the flagstones until the sound grated unpleasantly against his teeth. Chalk dust coated the teacher's table. Pale fingerprints showed on an abandoned stack of cracked slates, and a sour smell of damp parchment lingered beneath the stronger odor of old floor polish. He set a battered copy of Intermediate Transfiguration on the desk nearest the door, opened it to a page chosen at random, then wedged Crab's borrowed silver sickle between 2 pages. Anyone entering quickly would see the book before noticing the coin. Anyone who had already been watching Crab might recognize both. A second marker went beneath the teacher's lectern. A green quill with its shaft snapped near the nib. Draco had taken it from the rubbish beside the Slytherin notice board because it looked forgettable, which was precisely why it suited him. He arranged the broken end so that it pointed toward the corridor, then crossed to a cupboard with one hinge hanging loose and placed an empty potion vial on the lowest shelf. None of the objects meant anything together. The trick was to make Potter believe they did. Footsteps passed beyond the door. Draco froze beside the cupboard, listening until they faded toward the staircase. His wand remained inside his sleeve, where he could reach it without advertising that he expected trouble. He disliked using magic for this sort of thing when hands worked better. Spells left effects people recognized, while a moved chair or misplaced coin looked like ordinary carelessness. Potter expected schemes now. Draco intended to give him one so plain that suspicion would do most of the work. He stepped into the corridor and shut the classroom door until only a narrow seam remained. Crab was supposed to appear from the western passage with the coin no longer in his pocket, make himself visible near the stairs, then leave without entering the room. Goyle's task was simpler. Stand near a suit of armor 2 corridors away and become conspicuous enough that anyone following Crab would assume he had been posted as a lookout. Draco had spent 10 minutes explaining that looking bored was more convincing than staring at every passerby. Whether Goyle had understood the distinction remained doubtful. A scrape of shoe leather sounded from below. Crab came into view carrying 2 books under one arm. His pace was too stiff, but not catastrophically so, and he managed not to look at Draco's hiding place. A few seconds later, another figure appeared at the bend in the stairs. Black hair, glasses, shoulders pitched forward with the irritating determination Potter wore whenever he believed he was about to prove something. Draco drew back behind a stone pillar. Potter did not call after Crab. That was good. He followed at a distance instead, pretending to read a folded piece of parchment while his eyes lifted every few steps. Draco watched through the gap between pillar and wall, close enough to make out Potter's school bag striking his hip. Crabbe reached the abandoned classroom, slowed exactly where instructed, and shifted the books from one arm to the other. Then he continued past. Potter stopped. The smallest satisfaction pulled at Draco's mouth before he crushed it. Harry examined the door first, then the stretch of corridor behind him. Draco held perfectly still, while Potter pushed the door open and slipped inside. No hesitation, no attempt to summon a teacher, no brilliant burst of Gryffindor caution. Potter had found a suspicious room and entered it because that was what Potter always did. Draco waited 3 breaths before moving. He crossed behind the door without touching it and took position beside a narrow window in the corridor wall. The glass had been painted over generations ago, leaving only tiny clear flakes near one edge where the coating had peeled away. From there, he could see part of the classroom reflected in the dark glass of a framed portrait opposite. The portrait's occupant, a wizard with an enormous lace collar, was asleep, with his chin sunk into his chest, and fortunately paid no attention. Potter went directly to the book. Interesting. He picked it up, checked beneath it, then opened the pages and found the sickle. Draco's suspicion tightened into something more useful. Potter had not merely wandered into the classroom because Crabbe slowed nearby. He had expected an object to matter. Harry turned the coin between his fingers, studied both faces, and examined the desk as though Draco might have carved instructions into it. Then Potter looked toward the teacher's lectern. He had noticed the quill. Draco's satisfaction disappeared. Potter crossed the room and crouched beside the lectern. His hand vanished beneath it, then reappeared holding the snapped green quill. He compared it with the sickle before searching the floor around his knees. Draco had intended the quill to be discovered eventually, not immediately. The fact that Potter had gone from the first planted object to the second without prompting meant he was not simply chasing Draco anymore. He was learning how Draco hid things. Potter moved toward the cupboard next. Draco backed away from the window. That was enough. He turned down the passage, keeping his steps ordinary until the classroom door could no longer be seen. Potter had taken the trail exactly as planned, but he had taken it too efficiently. Draco had wanted to establish how much Harry knew. The answer was more than Crabbe's loose mouth could explain. A familiar voice stopped him at the next corner. Malfoy. Draco halted. Snape stood beneath a torch bracket with a roll of parchment tucked beneath one arm. His black robes fell without a crease, and the light made the hollows beneath his cheekbones look sharper than usual. He did not ask where Draco had been. That would have been easier. Professor? Snape's gaze traveled from Draco's face to the faint chalk streak across his cuff. You appear industrious? Draco brushed the mark away with the side of his thumb. I dropped a book. In an empty corridor? There are classrooms nearby. So there are. Snape shifted the parchment to his other hand. It was almost nothing, that movement, but Draco had learned to distrust quietness in adults who already suspected him. Snape had approached without being heard. Worse, he had chosen this corridor at this moment, while Potter was still inside the room Draco had prepared. Draco angled his body enough to block Snape's view, back toward the classroom. You wanted something? One of Snape's eyebrows moved slightly. Must I? No. Then perhaps you might explain why Crabbe has spent the afternoon carrying a coin he did not possess at breakfast. Draco's stomach contracted. He kept his face blank. You're keeping track of Crabbe's money now? I am keeping track of several things. Snape's voice remained soft enough that anyone passing would have mistaken the exchange for an ordinary teacher correcting a student. Draco hated that tone more than anger. Anger could be provoked, redirected, made foolish. Snape rarely gave anyone so convenient a handle. Draco shifted his weight onto his other foot. Crabbe owed me a sickle. Yes. 4? Draco looked directly at him. Do I need permission to lend money? Snape studied him for several seconds. No. But you have recently developed an unusual fondness for arrangements involving other people's pockets. The words landed harder than Draco expected. He said nothing. Snape's eyes dropped briefly toward Draco's sleeve, where the shape of his wand pressed against the cloth. You change your routes. You send your friends ahead. You collect objects that are later moved elsewhere. You are becoming elaborate. That confirmed one thing and damaged another. Snape had been watching. Draco gave a short laugh that sounded colder than he felt. Perhaps Hogwarts has become so dull that you've decided to follow students about. Perhaps. Behind them, a door hinge creaked. Potter. Draco did not turn. Neither did Snape. The silence between them changed shape. Snape's attention sharpened by a degree so slight that another person might have missed it. Draco understood immediately that he had just been placed between two observers, each of whom wanted a different answer. If Potter came around the corner now and saw them together, he would add Snape to whatever theory he had already invented. If Snape saw Potter emerging from the planted classroom, he might understand that Draco was feeding Harry false clues. Draco had no intention of giving either of them that much. He raised his voice enough for it to carry. If you've finished accusing me of moving coins, Professor, I've got somewhere to be. Snape's expression hardened. Your impatience is not an argument. No, but standing in corridors interrogating me isn't exactly proof of anything either. A shadow crossed the wall behind Snape. Potter had reached the corner. Draco shoved both hands into his robe pockets and stepped sideways, deliberately exposing the route toward the staircase, while concealing the abandoned classroom behind his own body. Potter appeared several yards away and stopped the instant he saw them. The sickle was no longer in his hand. Perfect. Draco gave him one contemptuous glance. Lost, Potter. Harry's eyes went first to Draco, then Snape, then the corridor behind them. No. Pity. You usually look more convincing when you are. Potter's mouth tightened. Snape turned just enough to acknowledge him. Potter. Professor? Harry continued toward the stairs, but his right pocket sagged slightly, with something round and heavy. Draco saw it. So did Snape. Nothing in Snape's face acknowledged the fact, which was worse than if he had demanded the coin immediately. Harry passed them without another word. Draco waited until the sound of his steps vanished down the staircase. Then he turned back towards Snape and found the professor watching him with new attention. You arranged that, Snape said. Draco let his shoulders lift in a careless shrug. Arranged what? The boy. I don't control Potter. No, Snape replied. You merely predicted him. For the first time since entering the corridor, Draco had no answer prepared. Snape stepped closer, lowering his voice. Whatever you are doing, Draco, your methods are changing. The use of his first name made Draco's jaw tighten. "You've been counting my methods?" "I have been noticing them." Draco took one pace backward. "Then perhaps you should find something else to notice." Snape's mouth flattened. "That would be easier if you were less determined to make yourself visible." Draco turned away before the conversation could go further. He did not ask permission to leave. The stones beneath his shoes felt uneven as he crossed the corridor, and he could still picture the slight bulge in Potter's pocket where the planted sickle now sat. The bait had worked. That was no longer the important part. Snape had known about the coin before Potter ever touched it. Madame Pomfrey shut the hospital wing door hard enough to rattle the glass panes. Draco shifted the folded essay under his arm and pretended to read the notice pinned beside the entrance. The parchment warned students not to visit patients without permission and contained 3 separate instructions about bringing food onto the ward, none of which interested him. What mattered was the smell slipping through the door before it settled back into its frame. Boiled linen, dittany, something medicinal and bitter, and the faint sweetness of potion ingredients that clung to every infirmary in the castle. Katie Bell was behind that door, and Draco needed to know exactly how much she remembered without appearing to care at all. 2 second-year Hufflepuffs came out, whispering, and hurried past him. Draco turned one page of his essay without looking down. He had chosen the corridor because students passed through it often enough that standing there would not look unnatural, but not so often that he could not listen. A bench stood beneath the nearest window, its wood polished smooth by generations of patients and worried friends. He placed the essay on it, bent as though adjusting the strap of his bag, and checked the reflection in the dark window glass. No Potter. That helped less than it should have. The hospital wing door opened again. Professor McGonagall emerged first, thin-lipped and carrying a square parcel wrapped in brown paper. Behind her came Madame Pomfrey, who kept one hand on the latch while speaking in a voice pitched low enough to suggest she did not want the patients to hear. Draco straightened over his essay, turning his shoulder slightly so that his face remained visible but uninterested. McGonagall said something about St. Mungo's and Katie's parents, and Pomfrey answered that the girl was stable but still required careful observation. Stable, not useful. Draco picked up his parchment and moved toward the bench at the opposite end of the corridor. His shoes made a muted scuff against the flagstones, neither hurried nor slow. McGonagall passed him without comment, though her eyes rested on him for a fraction longer than he liked. Madame Pomfrey watched him next. "Are you waiting for someone, Mr. Malfoy?" Draco raised the essay. Professor Slughorn asked for revisions. In the hospital wing, he didn't specify where I should do them. Pomfrey's expression suggested she considered sarcasm a minor infection, best treated with immediate expulsion. "Then revise elsewhere." Draco gave her a look of mild offense and started away. "Mr. Malfoy." He stopped. Pomfrey reached toward the bench he had just left and lifted something between 2 fingers. A strand of pale thread dangled from her hand. "Your cuff is coming apart." Draco looked down. A fine strip of black stitching had pulled loose near his wrist. He had not noticed it. "Thank you," he said, and took the thread from her. Pomfrey returned inside. Draco continued down the passage without changing pace, but his attention remained on the damaged cuff. He touched the seam once with his thumb and felt a tiny rough break where the thread had been drawn free. The robe was not old. There was no reason for the stitching to fail. unless it had snagged on something. He turned into the next corridor and stopped beside a stone recess containing an empty suit of armor stand. The loose thread measured nearly 4 inches. Someone could follow movement with ordinary clues. A snagged sleeve, chalk on a cuff, mud on a shoe, a missing coin. Draco had been thinking about magic because the room itself demanded magical access, yet every trail outside it had been physical. Potter had watched Crab. Snape had tracked the sickle. Neither needed to penetrate the room if Draco was carrying evidence out with him. That possibility tightened his grip around the thread. Voices approached from the stairwell. Draco tucked the thread into his pocket and drew the essay open again. Madam Hooch came around the corner beside Professor Flitwick, both speaking about a student who had injured a wrist during practice. Neither paid Draco more than a passing glance. He waited until their steps receded, then moved toward the service passage that connected the hospital corridor with the older classrooms. A chalk mark sat low on the wall. It was barely more than a pale crescent near the skirting stone, the sort of thing a shoe might leave by accident. Draco crouched and touched it with one finger. Powder came away easily, fresh. He looked along the corridor. There were no classroom blackboards nearby. The mark could have meant nothing. He hated that possibility because meaningless things were the most difficult to rule out. Draco wiped the chalk from his fingertip onto the edge of his essay and followed the wall toward the next turn. Another mark appeared 3 yards farther on, this one higher, beside a narrow stone ledge. Then a third, almost invisible, near an alcove where students sometimes left bags before entering the ward. A route. Not toward the room of requirement, toward the hospital wing. Draco's breathing shortened. He followed the line backwards. The chalk marks led away from the infirmary corridor, down a shallow stair, across a landing, and toward a passage used by prefects and teachers because it cut behind several classrooms. Draco counted 6 marks before the trail stopped. At the final one, something else had been scratched into the stone. A tiny cross. He crouched until his knee pressed painfully against the floor. It was not made with chalk. The cross had been scored with a sharp point. Draco reached into his sleeve and drew his wand, holding it close to the wall rather than pointing it outward. He examined the groove. Fresh stone showed inside the scratch. Someone had marked this place deliberately. The question was why? A door opened nearby. Draco stood fast and slipped the wand back out of sight. Professor Sinistra stepped into the passage carrying a bundle of star charts under one arm. She almost collided with him and recoiled. "Mr. Malfoy, Professor." She adjusted the charts. "What are you doing here?" "Looking for Professor Slughorn. His office is nowhere near here." "I noticed." Her mouth twitched, uncertain whether he was being insolent or merely unpleasant. Then she looked toward the scratch on the wall. Draco noticed her noticing. "Someone has been defacing the stone," she said. "So it seems." Sinistra shifted the charts against her hip. "Filch has complained about marks appearing in several corridors this week." Draco's attention sharpened. "Several?" "Yes, near the library, the 4th floor, and outside one of the old classrooms." She frowned. "I assumed students were playing some ridiculous game. Old classroom." Draco kept his expression empty. The classroom with the sickle. Filch saw them? He saw the marks. I doubt he saw whoever made them. Sinistra moved past him. Draco waited until she reached the stairs before speaking. "Professor?" She turned. "Did Filch say whether the marks were all chalk?" Sinistra frowned harder now. "Some chalk. Some scratched. Thank you. Her suspicion deepened, but she left. Draco looked back at the cross. Not Potter. Harry would not quietly mark routes for a week and then say nothing. He would follow, confront, accuse, search, tell Weasley and Granger, or eventually involve a teacher when he believed he had enough. Scratched stone and chalk crescents were patient. Methodical. Snape could be patient. Snape also knew about the sickle. Draco touched the scored cross and felt the sharp edge bite his fingertip. The possibility settled unpleasantly into place. He moved quickly now, not running, following the route toward the fourth-floor corridor Sinistra had mentioned. 2 more chalk traces appeared near a stair rail. Another scratch showed beside a door hinge. None formed words or symbols beyond simple marks, yet the pattern was obvious once he started looking for it. Someone had been recording movement through the castle. Not just his, routes, stops, perhaps encounters. The implications were worse than being followed by Potter. At the 4th-floor landing, Draco found Filch himself kneeling beside the wall with a bucket and stiff brush. Mrs. Norris sat beside him, tail curled around her paws. Filch muttered as he scrubbed at a chalk streak that had already stained the stone white. "Filthy little vandals," he growled, marking walls, scratching doors. "Think the castle belongs to them." Draco stopped 2 steps above him. Filch looked up. "You?" Draco ignored the hostility. "How many?" Filch's eyes narrowed. "How many what?" "Marks? Why?" "Because I'm curious." "That'll be the day." Draco pulled a galleon halfway from his pocket, let Filch see the edge, then slipped it back again. Filch's expression changed. "More than 20, he said. "Maybe 30. Different floors, been cleaning them since Monday." Draco kept his face still. "Any pattern?" Filch spat into the bucket. "Students don't have patterns, they have bad breeding." Mrs. Norris stood and sniffed Draco's shoe. "Did any appear outside the hospital wing?" Filch looked at him sharply. "Yes." Draco's pulse kicked once. "Before or after Belle was brought in?" Filch squinted. That question mattered enough that even he sensed it. "Before," he said at last. "Couple days before." Draco's stomach dropped. The marks near the hospital wing had not been made because of Katie Bell. They had been there before the attack, which meant the person marking routes had anticipated movement through that corridor before Katie ever touched the necklace. Draco took 1 step back. Filch leaned on the brush handle. "What's it to you?" "Nothing. Doesn't look like nothing." Draco turned away. At the top of the stairs, another chalk crescent sat beneath the rail. He bent, rubbed it once, and found a hair caught in the powder. Black, straight, too long to be Potter's. Draco held it between finger and thumb. Snape. The conclusion came too easily, and that alone should have made him cautious. But the evidence pressed in from every side. Snape knew the coin. Snape had been watching his routes. Snape had appeared near the classroom at precisely the wrong moment. Now a black hair lay in chalk on a marked corridor. Draco folded the strand into the loose thread from his cuff and closed both inside his pocket. Then he looked toward the staircase leading down to the dungeons. For the first time, the threat did not feel like Potter following blindly behind him. It looked like someone walking ahead. Snape's office door closed with a soft click behind Draco. The room was warmer than the corridor, though not comfortably so. Shelves crowded with glass jars climbed the walls, their contents distorted by cloudy preserving fluid. Roots, animal organs, things with too many joints, things Draco preferred not to identify. A cauldron stood cold on the side table beside a stack of student essays, and the stone floor carried the familiar, sour trace of old potion ingredients that never quite left the dungeons. Draco remained standing while Snape crossed behind his desk. "You wish to speak with me?" Snape said. Draco had not. He placed both hands behind his back to stop himself from touching the pocket containing the black hair and the torn thread. "You sent for me." Snape sat and indicated the chair opposite. Draco did not take it. A long pause settled between them. Snape's gaze moved once over Draco's robes, shoes, sleeves, and face, not lingering anywhere long enough to look like an inspection. That precision irritated Draco more than open suspicion would have. He had spent days noticing who watched whom, and Snape still managed to make observation look effortless. "You have become unusually interested in corridors," Snape said. Draco gave a faint shrug. "It's a school. There are quite a lot of them. And abandoned classrooms. I suppose I should apologize for broadening my education." Snape ignored the tone. "You have also begun sending Crabbe and Goyle through parts of the castle with instructions they are clearly incapable of understanding." "They usually are. That does not answer the point." Draco shifted closer to the desk and looked down at the parchment nearest Snape's hand. 5th-year essays. Nothing relevant. "Maybe there isn't a point." Snape's fingers touched the edge of one page and straightened it. "You placed a sickle in an empty classroom." There it was. Draco felt the back of his neck tighten. He kept his voice steady. "Did I?" "Potter removed it." "That sounds like Potter's problem." "Then why did you watch him do it?" Draco's eyes snapped to Snape's. Snape did not smile. The office felt smaller now, not because either of them had moved, but because Draco had just lost one of the spaces he thought was private. He'd been careful at the classroom. Careful enough that Potter never saw him. Careful enough that even the portrait remained asleep. "How much exactly have you been following me?" Draco asked. Snape's expression hardened by a degree. "Enough." "That isn't an answer." "No, it is a warning." Draco pulled out the chair at last, but instead of sitting, he rested both palms on its back. The wood was smooth under his fingers. "You keep saying that as though I need one." "You do." "I don't. You are 16. The number landed like an insult. Draco's hands tightened around the chair. "I'm aware. You are behaving as though concealment and control are the same thing. And you're behaving as though I asked for advice." Snape leaned back slightly. That was dangerous. Anger from him would have been easier. Calm meant he had decided to let Draco expose himself. "I know about your mother's concern," Snape said. Draco let go of the chair. "Don't. I know what has been asked of you." "You don't know anything." Snape's face changed almost imperceptibly at that. Not surprise, recognition. Draco saw it and regretted the words immediately. He moved away from the chair and toward one of the shelves, pretending interest in a jar filled with pale, curled roots. The glass was cool when he touched it with one fingertip. "You think because she spoke to you, that means you understand? She did more than speak?" Draco turned. Snape had gone too far. The unbreakable vow was not something Draco could mention outright without revealing how much his mother had told him, and Narcissa had told him very little. Enough, though. Enough for him to understand that Snape had inserted himself into a task Voldemort had given Draco alone. "You made yourself useful," Draco said. Snape's eyes narrowed. "I made myself available." I don't need you available. You may. I won't. The words came sharper than Draco intended. He forced himself to release the jar before he cracked it against the shelf. His palm had begun to sweat. Snape stood. He was not much taller than Draco now, but the movement shifted the entire conversation. Your father believed confidence could replace preparation. Draco's face went cold. Leave him out of it. I would prefer to. Then do. Snape stepped around the desk. You are drawing attention. Potter is watching you. Others are beginning to notice irregularities. Draco thought of the chalk marks, the scratches, the hair. He looked at Snape's shoulders and hairline, suddenly aware of every loose strand. You mean you are? Snape stopped. Draco took the black hair from his pocket. He laid it on the desk. Snape looked down. That was the first genuine reaction Draco had seen from him. Not much, only a flicker, enough. I found that on the 4th floor, Draco said. In chalk marks, somebody has been leaving around the castle. Snape's eyes returned to his face. And you've been following my movements? Have I? You knew about the sickle. You knew Crabbe carried it. You knew where I was when Potter found it. Those are observations. They're a pattern. Snape's mouth tightened. Draco reached into his pocket again and added the loose black thread beside the hair. This came off my robe near the hospital wing. Someone has been marking corridors there too. Snape examined neither object closely. That bothered Draco. If the evidence meant nothing, Snape should have dismissed it. If it meant something, he should have reacted. Instead, he simply waited. Draco understood what that silence was asking him to do. Talk more, he almost laughed. You want to know what I'm working on? I already know enough. No, you don't. Then enlighten me. Draco felt the trap. He stepped away from the desk and walked toward the office door, then stopped halfway. There's nothing to enlighten? Snape's voice followed him. You have been testing routes? Draco turned. I've been avoiding Potter. With coins? Yes. With marked objects? Yes. With Crabbe and Goyle positioned as lookouts? Draco hesitated. There. Too specific. Snape noticed the hesitation. Draco noticed him noticing. The conversation had become a series of tiny cuts. Perhaps I don't like being followed, Draco said. Then stop making yourself interesting. Potter decided I was interesting before term began. Potter is not the only person who has eyes. Draco looked again at the hair on the desk. A thought took shape. He could not prove Snape had made the corridor marks, but he could feed him something false, something simple, something believable. Then watch what changed. Draco let his shoulders loosen as though tired of resisting. Fine, Snape waited. Draco looked toward the shelves, avoiding his face deliberately now. I've been using the empty classrooms because I need privacy. For what? Potions? Snape's expression did not move. Draco continued before the lie could become too clean. Slughorn keeps half his ingredients locked away. I've been practicing things I don't want him asking about. What things? Draco gave a short, humorless laugh. You're the defense against the dark arts professor? Guess. Snape studied him. Draco added one more piece. There's an old storeroom near the charms corridor. I've been using it. False. There was a storeroom there. Draco knew because he had passed it twice. The lie would hold long enough. Snape looked toward the hair and thread on the desk. And the marks? I thought somebody had noticed. Who? You. Silence. Then Snape said, You are a poor liar when you are trying to appear careless. Draco's stomach tightened, but he forced a sneer. "And you're very pleased with yourself when you think you're clever." Snape moved closer. "Listen to me carefully. Whatever you are attempting, stop involving Crabbe and Goyle in ways they do not understand." "Why?" "Because they are liabilities." "That hasn't bothered you before." "It bothers me now." Draco gave him a cold smile. "Then perhaps you should keep watching them." Snape's gaze sharpened. "Good. Let him." Draco reached for the door. "Draco." His hand stayed on the handle. Snape's voice had changed, not softer, more final. "I have offered assistance because your mother asked it of me and because circumstances made that assistance necessary." Draco did not turn around. "I don't want it." "I know." "Then stop." A pause. When Snape spoke again, the words carried no anger at all. "Very well." Draco looked back. Snape had returned to the desk. The black hair and thread still lay there between them. "I will not cover your unexplained absences," Snape said. "I will not redirect questions from other staff. I will not intervene when Potter's suspicions become inconvenient. If you insist upon handling this alone, you may experience what alone actually means." Draco stared at him. He had expected resistance, perhaps another warning, perhaps a threat disguised as concern, not withdrawal. "You think I need you." Snape picked up the hair and dropped it into the wastebasket. "I think you have made your position clear." Draco's mouth went dry. Something about that irritated him more than anything else Snape had said. The lie had cost him before he had even learned whether it worked. He opened the door. Snape's final words reached him as he stepped into the dungeon corridor. "Do not mistake my silence for ignorance." Draco shut the door behind him. For several seconds, he stood facing the opposite wall, the cold stone close enough to touch. Then he took the false storeroom key from his pocket. He had planted it there before entering. Snape had never asked about it. Draco turned it once between his fingers, slipped it back into his robes, and walked away. If Snape searched the charms corridor now, Draco would know. And if he did not, Draco had just thrown away his only protection for nothing. The tap would not stop dripping. Each drop struck the chipped porcelain basin with a small, hollow tick, leaving a rust-colored stain around the drain where nobody had bothered to repair it. Draco stood beside the sinks with his sleeves rolled above his wrists and emptied the contents of his pockets onto the dry counter one item at a time. A folded scrap of parchment, 2 newts, his wand, a brass button from an old school robe, the false storeroom key. None of it looked dangerous, which was precisely why he had brought it here. Moaning Myrtle's bathroom had one advantage over almost anywhere else in the castle. People avoided it voluntarily. The tiles were cracked, several taps had gone green around their bases, and the damp smell from the pipes mixed badly with the sharp soap Madame Pomfrey's cleaning staff used elsewhere. Myrtle herself was absent for once, though Draco had checked twice before shutting the door. He needed 10 minutes without Crabbe, Goyle, Potter, Snape, or any other person mistaking proximity for permission to interfere. He placed the false key near the edge of the basin and set the brass button beside it. Those were his controls. The key had been meant for Snape. The button had not. Draco pulled a narrow strip of parchment from inside his robe and unfolded it across the counter. On it, he had listed the objects he could remember using during the previous fortnight, but not where he had hidden them. A coin, a cup, a quill, a scale, 2 folded notes, a spool of thread, a damaged buckle. He had forced himself to write the list from memory because returning to the room merely to check would contaminate the very pattern he was trying to understand. The dripping continued. He tapped the parchment twice with the tip of one fingernail. Every disturbance he could prove had happened outside the room. The thought had been sitting at the edge of his mind since the hospital corridor, refusing to arrange itself properly. Now he made himself test it without guessing. The scale had moved inside the room, yes, but only after Draco had carried it there and positioned it as a marker. The teacup had not moved. Nothing around the vanishing cabinet had changed. No tool had vanished. No scrap of parchment had been unfolded. He frowned. That was wrong. The scale had been inside. Draco leaned closer to the parchment, unless he had misunderstood what the scale proved. He pictured the sequence precisely. He had found it upright. Reset it, gone to investigate the fallen mannequin. Returned. Upright again. No footprints. No disturbed dust, except around the base. No second object moved. His mouth tightened. Someone hidden in the room could have done it. Someone invisible could have done it. Potter owned an invisibility cloak. Draco knew that much from years of rumors, suspicious disappearances, and Potter's impossible talent for turning up where he had no business being. Yet if Potter had stood yards from the cabinet and watched Draco work, why steal a sickle later? Why follow Crab? Why ask questions whose answers he would already possess? Draco lifted the brass button and rolled it across the counter. It struck the key with a dry click. That contradiction mattered. He picked up his wand and pointed it toward the bathroom door. Calla Portis. The lock sealed. No invented trick. No elaborate charm. Just privacy. Draco returned the wand to the counter and pulled his left sleeve down. A pale smear marked the cuff. Chalk. He had collected it from the hospital corridor without noticing. That annoyed him. More importantly, it proved something. The observer did not need to move objects Draco had planted. Draco himself carried traces between locations. He wiped the cuff with a damp corner of parchment. White powder gathered on the fibers. He stared at it for a moment, then began checking the rest of his robes. Mud near the hem. One loose thread at the shoulder. A faint scrape along the leather of his bag. Nothing magical, everything visible. He turned the bag over. The underside showed a thin, pale streak. Chalk again. Draco stopped moving. The same material had marked routes around the castle. His route could have been recorded simply by contact. He had assumed the chalk crescents were deliberately placed signs. What if some were transfers? Someone marks a wall. A lookout brushes it. Draco takes the lookout's bag. Later, Draco brushes another surface. The trail spreads. Messy. Imperfect. Exactly the sort of thing Potter could notice without understanding. Draco took the false key and dragged one edge through the chalk residue on his sleeve. A pale line appeared across the metal. He pressed the key against a tile. The mark transferred cleanly. He repeated the test with the brass button. Same result. His pulse quickened, but this time not from fear. Evidence. He'd finally stopped staring at people long enough to examine the objects. Draco reached for the list. The sickle had moved from his pocket to Goyle, then to Crab, then into the classroom, then Potter had taken it. The quill had come from the Slytherin notice board. The loose thread had caught somewhere near the hospital wing. The black hair had been found in chalk. All of them had passed through other hands or other places before becoming suspicious. He had mistaken contamination for surveillance. Not all of it. Someone was still watching, but not from inside the room. Draco leaned over the basin and ran cold water over his fingers. Chalk swirled away in thin, cloudy ribbons and disappeared down the stained drain. The metal tap bit into his palm when he shut it harder than necessary. Snape had not needed to enter the room to know about the coin. He could simply have watched Crabbe. Potter had not needed the room to learn Draco's habits. He could simply have followed the lookouts. The scale remained the only impossible piece. Draco dried his hands on a rough towel hanging beside the mirror. Then he remembered how he had carried it, not openly, wrapped in cloth, inside the same bag he had once handed to Goyle while adjusting his robe near the 7th floor stairs. Draco froze. The bag. He grabbed it and opened every compartment. Books, parchment, a cracked quill, nothing else. He ran his fingertips along the inner seams. Near the bottom, something scratched his skin. A splinter. He pulled the lining aside. A tiny tear had opened where the stitching had weakened. Behind it lay a narrow wedge of gray dust. Not room dust, corridor dust. He smelled it. Dry stone and chalk. The bag had been contaminated before he entered the room. Draco sank onto the edge of the basin. For several seconds, the only sound was that infernal tap beginning to drip again because he had failed to close it properly. He had carried the trail in himself. That did not explain the scale physically moving, but it changed. Who could have known it mattered? Someone outside could have seen him handle the scale before entering. Someone could have known it was one of his markers without ever seeing the cabinet. His eyes moved toward the bathroom mirror. A crack divided his reflection from forehead to chin. Draco stepped closer. He was thinner than at the start of term. He disliked seeing it. His cheekbones looked sharper, and the skin beneath his eyes had taken on the gray cast of too little sleep. He touched nothing. The person watching him did not need secret magical access. They needed patience. They needed Crabbe and Goyle. They needed Draco to repeat himself. The bathroom door rattled. Draco snapped around. "Who is it?" No answer. The handle moved again. Then a familiar voice came through the wood. "Malfoy?" "Potter, of course." Draco swept the parchment list into his robe, pocketed the key and button, and picked up his wand. "What? Why's the door locked?" Draco almost laughed. Potter sounded suspicious even when asking a stupid question. "Because I locked it." A pause. "Why?" "Perhaps I enjoy the thrilling privacy of a lavatory." Potter did not reply. Draco crossed to the door but did not open it. He could imagine Potter standing on the other side, probably with Weasley nearby, both convinced that silence itself amounted to evidence. Then Draco noticed something at the bottom of the door. A shadow moved. Not one, two. Potter had company. Good. That meant Draco could test one final thing. He took the false storeroom key from his pocket and let it fall deliberately onto the tile. The metal rang sharply. Potter's shadow shifted at once. Draco smiled without amusement. He unlocked the door. Potter stood outside with Weasley behind him. Harry's eyes immediately dropped to the floor, to the key, exactly as expected. Draco bent, picked it up, and slipped it away before either boy could see its shape properly. "Enjoying yourself?" Draco asked. Harry looked back at his face. "What were you doing?" "Washing my hands." "For 10 minutes?" Weasley muttered something under his breath. Draco ignored him. Potter's gaze moved to Draco's bag. Not the wand, not the door, the bag. That was the answer, not all of it. Enough. Draco stepped between them and left the bathroom. Harry turned to watch him go. Draco did not look back. He no longer believed Snape had entered the room. He no longer believed Potter had either. And that meant the most frightening conclusion was also the simplest one. The room was still secret. Draco was the leak. The restricted section gate gave a dry metallic click when Madame Pince opened it for a 7th-year Ravenclaw, and Draco used the brief distraction to slide behind a shelf 2 rows deeper into the library. Books pressed in on both sides, their cracked spines smelling of dust, leather dressing, and the faint peppery scent of old glue. He carried no notes now, no marked parchment, no convenient objects, nothing that could pass from his hands to Crabbe's or Goyle's and return with somebody else's attention clinging to it. Instead, he had brought only his school bag and the memory of every route he had used since September, which was proving less reliable than he wanted to admit. He pulled a volume of magical drafts and potions from the shelf and set it sideways across 2 others. The position mattered only because he would move it again himself. Draco stepped into the next aisle and counted silently to 20 before returning. The book remained exactly where he had placed it. He repeated the exercise twice with different shelves, then changed direction and used an atlas from the History of Magic section. Nothing shifted. No one appeared. No pale hand reached around a corner to straighten anything. Good. That left people. Crabbe and Goyle were sitting at a table near the back wall when Draco found them. Crabbe had managed to stain the corner of a parchment with ink, while Goyle was copying a paragraph from a textbook with the slow concentration of someone carving letters into stone. Neither looked up until Draco dropped into the chair opposite them. "Empty your pockets." Crabbe stared at him. "What? Both of you?" Goyle lowered his quill. Draco kept his voice quiet because Madame Pince was 3 tables away and possessed a supernatural talent for hearing noise through shelves. "Everything. Now." Crabbe reached inside his robes first. 2 knoots, a crumpled sweet wrapper, a bit of string, a broken quill nib. Goyle produced a chocolate frog card, a handkerchief, 3 bronze coins, and a small brass clasp Draco recognized from one of his own bags. His attention fixed on it. "Where did you get that?" Goyle picked up the clasp. "This?" "Yes, that." "Dunno." "That answer's becoming expensive." Goyle frowned and turned the clasp over. "Think it came off your bag?" Draco took it from him. The metal was scratched along one side. He remembered the tear in the lining. "Why was it in your pocket?" Goyle shrugged. Crabbe answered for him. "You gave him your bag last week?" Draco's gaze shifted. "When?" Crabbe scratched a smear of ink from his thumb. "Near the library." The words landed neatly against another memory. Potter bumping Crabbe, gray fibers, questions. Draco leaned forward. "What happened after I gave him the bag?" Goyle thought hard enough that his forehead creased. "You went to talk to Zabini." "And you?" "Waited." "Where?" "By the shelves." "Which shelves?" Goyle pointed toward the far side of the room. Draco followed the line with his eyes. 3 aisles from where Potter often sat with Granger. "Of course. Did anyone speak to you?" Goyle hesitated. Draco's patience thinned. "Did anyone touch the bag?" "No." "Did Potter come near you?" Goyle looked at Crabbe. Crabbe looked back. Draco set the brass clasp down between them. "I'm going to ask this once." Goyle swallowed. "He walked past." "How close?" "Close." "That is not a measurement?" "Close enough to hit the bag." There it was. Draco sat very still. Accidentally? Goyle nodded. Crabbe said, probably. Draco gave him a look that stopped the sentence there. Harry had not needed to steal anything. He only needed to brush against what Draco carried. A torn clasp, chalk, a bit of thread, the shape of a hard object inside the bag. Enough tiny facts, gathered separately, could become a route. Draco picked up the chocolate frog card. Where did this come from? Goyle blinked. Bought it. Where? Hogsmeade. You haven't been to Hogsmeade since the attack. Goyle's face changed. Crabbe looked suddenly interested. Draco turned the card over. Agrippa, old, bent near one corner, not purchased recently. Try again. Goyle rubbed one thick finger across his nose. Potter gave it me. Draco's head came up. When? A couple days ago. Why? He asked if I had that one. Crabbe snorted. You don't even collect them. That's what I said. Draco examined the card. Nothing had been written on it. No obvious charm, no mark. Still, Potter had given Goyle an object for no reason. That was not random. What happened after? Goyle shifted in his chair. He asked if you still liked collecting old stuff. Draco stared at him. I never collected cards. I told him that. What exactly did he ask? Goyle looked miserable again. Said you were always carrying bits of rubbish now. Asked if you'd started collecting things. Draco placed the card down slowly. Harry had noticed the markers, not their purpose. Their category, small, worthless objects. That changed the scale again. The brass scale itself had not mattered because Potter knew it specifically. It had mattered because it looked like the sort of thing Draco had begun carrying. Potter was testing the same theory from the opposite side. Draco pushed his chair back. Crabbe frowned. Where are you going? Nowhere. That made both boys look more confused. Draco pointed at the table instead. We're doing this properly. He took Goyle's parchment and flipped it over. Then, with the blunt end of the quill, so no ink would remain, he traced invisible lines into the paper. Tell me everywhere Potter has spoken to either of you since term began. Crabbe groaned. Draco's stare silenced him. They began. Outside the great hall, near the library, 4th floor, 7th floor. Near the stairs, below the astronomy tower, once beside the courtyard, twice near the dungeon entrance. Draco pressed each location into the parchment without writing words. A pattern emerged in pressure marks alone. Potter had not been following Draco directly. He had been intercepting the lookouts. That was cleverer than Draco had credited him for. Annoyingly clever. What did he ask in the courtyard? Crabbe thought. If you had been sick? Draco's mouth tightened. Why? Said you looked awful. Goyle nodded. You did? Draco ignored that. What else? If you were skipping meals, why would that matter? Crabbe shrugged. Maybe he thought you were poisoned. No, Potter thinks I'm doing the poisoning. Madam Pince hissed for silence from across the room. Draco lowered his voice further. What about the dungeon entrance? Goyle answered. Asked if Snape had been giving you extra lessons. That stopped him. Harry had connected Snape too. Not because Snape had entered the room, because Snape had been seen speaking to Draco. The same mistake Draco had made with the hair. People became evidence if you wanted them to. Draco looked down at the faint grooves on the parchment. Then he understood something worse. Crabbe and Goyle had not merely answered Potter's questions. They had altered their behavior because of them. How many times have you changed where you stood? Because Potter was nearby. Neither answered. Draco looked from one to the other. Crab finally said, "A few? How many?" "4, maybe 5. And you?" Goyle stared at the tabletop. "About that." Draco's jaw set. They had moved, improvised, swapped corridors, followed him at the wrong distance, carried his things. Every correction Draco made after seeing them out of place had created another visible signal. Harry had not been tracing a fixed route. He had been watching the route react. That was how he was getting closer. Draco snatched the chocolate frog card off the table and bent it in half. Goyle looked offended. "I wanted that." "You don't collect them." "Still." Draco tore the card across Agrippa's face and dropped both pieces into the waste bin beneath the table. "From now on, you carry nothing of mine." Crab frowned. "Nothing?" "Nothing." "Then how are we supposed to help?" "You're not." That hurt their pride. "Good." Crab sat straighter. "We can still watch?" "No." Goyle looked almost relieved. Draco leaned toward them, keeping his voice quiet but cutting every word cleanly. "You will go where you normally go. You will eat when you normally eat. You will stop standing outside corridors, pretending not to stand outside corridors. If Potter speaks to you, answer whatever you like, because I'm not giving you anything worth knowing." Crab's face darkened. "So we're useless?" Draco nearly said yes. He stopped. That answer would make Crab angry enough to prove otherwise, which was exactly what Draco could not afford. "You've done enough." Crab heard the insult anyway. His chair scraped backward. Several students looked over. Madam Pince snapped, "Quiet!" Crab muttered an apology and sat again. Draco gathered the remaining coins and rubbish from the table and pushed them back toward their owners. "No more lookouts." Goyle pocketed his knuts. Crab did not move. "What about Potter?" Draco glanced toward the shelf where Harry usually disappeared with Granger. "He can keep watching." Crab's brow furrowed. Draco picked up his bag, then stopped before slinging it over his shoulder. The brass clasp was still on the table. He left it there. That was deliberate. Crab noticed. "So you don't want that?" "No." "It's yours." "Not anymore." Draco walked away carrying the bag open. At the end of the aisle, he paused beside a shelf of battered reference books and tore the damaged inner lining free with both hands. The cloth resisted before giving way in a ragged strip. He folded it once, shoved it into a waste bin, and checked the empty compartment beneath. No chalk, no hidden scrap, no marker, nothing anyone could learn from later. When he reached the library doors, he saw Potter at a table near the windows. Harry was looking at Crab, not Draco. That was the final proof. Draco pushed through the doors without breaking stride. Behind him, for the first time in weeks, Crab and Goyle remained seated. The leak had not been one careless answer. It had been the entire system. Barnabas the Barmy was trying to teach the trolls ballet when Draco saw Potter's reflection in a breastplate. He did not turn his head. The suit of armor stood opposite the tapestry, its chest polished badly enough to bend faces into narrow streaks, but black hair and round spectacles were unmistakable even in distorted metal. Draco kept his left hand buried in his pocket around a useless scrap of twine he had carried there by habit, and the discovery disgusted him. He had forbidden Crab and Goyle from carrying markers, stripped his bag, abandoned the coins, the quills, the staged rooms, and still his own fingers had reached for something small to measure the corridor with. He walked past the tapestry. That was not what Potter expected. The hidden entrance remained blank stone because Draco had not asked the room for anything. He continued toward the next staircase, passing a pair of fourth-year girls arguing over a missing essay and a suit of armor whose visor had been wedged open with a spoon. His shoes carried him at the same pace he used between lessons, though every muscle in his back wanted to tighten under Potter's unseen gaze. He counted nothing. He marked nothing. He refused even to look at the torch brackets. Potter followed. Draco heard him only once when a shoe clipped the base of the armor behind them. The metal gave a small clunk. Potter recovered quickly, too quickly. Draco took the east passage instead of the western stairs. That should have broken the old pattern. It did not. At the intersection ahead, he caught Potter again, in the glass of a trophy case. Closer now. Draco turned into a classroom corridor and entered the first open room without hesitation. Professor Vector was inside. She stood beside the blackboard arranging a stack of arithmancy charts, and 3 seventh years were already seated near the front. Draco stopped with one hand still on the door. Professor Vector looked at him over the rims of her spectacles. "Mr. Malfoy?" He had never taken arithmancy. "Wrong room," he said. One of the 7th years laughed. Draco shut the door again. Potter was gone. That was worse. He moved to the end of the corridor and checked both directions. Nothing. No black hair. No red-headed Weasley. No Granger carrying too many books. Potter had stopped following because he no longer needed to. The idea arrived without drama and sat heavily in Draco's stomach. Harry had learned enough, not the room itself. Not yet. But enough about Draco's evasions to recognize when he was trying to shake a tail. Draco headed downstairs. He changed floors twice and took a route through the gallery beside the charms corridor, where framed certificates and old house photographs crowded the walls. At the far end, he found the storeroom he had lied to Snape about. The door was open. Only an inch. Draco slowed. That door had been shut when he last passed it. He reached the threshold and pushed it inward with the side of his shoe. Shelves filled the narrow room from floor to ceiling. Rolled maps, cracked ink bottles, spare cushions, boxes of chalk, damaged classroom tools, and bundles of parchment occupied every available surface. Nothing looked disturbed. That was exactly the problem. If Snape had searched it, he had left no obvious sign. If Potter had searched it, that would be unlikely. If neither had, Draco stopped. He was doing it again, building entire explanations from an open door. He stepped inside and closed it behind him. Dust grated beneath his soles. He took the false key from his pocket. Still there. Still useless. Draco looked at it for several seconds, then threw it into a box of broken quills. The metal disappeared with a soft clatter. One marker gone. He pulled out the twine. Another. Into the box. A folded piece of clean parchment followed, then the brass button, then 2 knuts he had begun using unconsciously as counting pieces. Draco stared at the small pile of objects in the rubbish. Everyone had become dangerous because he had given it meaning. He emptied the rest of his pockets. Nothing remained except his wand. That was better. He left the storeroom and locked it with the ordinary latch. At the next landing, Potter stood waiting. No pretense this time. Harry leaned against the wall with his arms folded, but his posture was too alert for casual conversation. He'd chosen the location well. Students moved through often enough to prevent a confrontation becoming private, but not so often that Draco could disappear into a crowd. "Following me again?" Draco said. Harry pushed away from the wall. "You keep going strange places." That sentence could describe your entire school career. Harry ignored it. Why did you go into that storeroom? To admire the chalk. Really? No, Potter. I've developed a passionate interest in broken quills. Harry's eyes traveled over Draco's robes. Empty pockets. No bag. No crab. No Goyle. Draco saw him register every absence. That was the danger now. Even removing the pattern had created a new pattern. Harry stepped nearer. You've stopped using them. Draco's mouth went still. Using who? Crab and Goyle. There was no point pretending not to understand. They were annoying me. They never annoyed you before. They've always annoyed me. I simply had more tolerance. Harry's expression changed slightly. Not belief, calculation. You stopped after the library. Draco felt cold beneath his collar. Potter had seen that too. Have you started keeping a diary about me? No. You should. Might give your life structure. Harry's face hardened. You're hiding something. Draco almost laughed. That was the first accusation Potter had made all afternoon that contained no useful information. How original. You keep disappearing. So do you. You were on the 7th floor again. Draco did not move. There it was. Harry had returned to the corridor independently, perhaps watched it, perhaps mapped entrances and exits, perhaps tried the wall. He still did not know how the room worked, or he would not be confronting Draco here. But he was close enough now that one mistake could finish it. Draco brushed past him. Harry caught the sleeve of his robe. Draco stopped. The grip lasted less than a second before Harry released him, but that was enough. Contact. Another thing Draco had spent days overvaluing. He looked at the place Harry had touched. No fiber, no powder, no hidden object. Just cloth. For the first time, that felt clean. Keep your hands off me, Draco said. Harry lowered his voice. Then stop giving me reasons to follow you. Draco turned his head. You don't need reasons. Harry said nothing. That silence told Draco enough. He walked away. Potter followed again. Of course he did. Draco did not lead him toward the 7th floor. He went to the Great Hall. Students were beginning to gather between lessons, filling the long tables in loose groups. The smell of bread, gravy, ink, and damp wool settled over the room. Draco chose a place near the Slytherin table where Pansy Parkinson sat correcting an essay. She looked up. Where have you been? Everywhere. Pansy frowned. You look awful. Draco pulled a goblet toward himself. Thank you. She continued watching him. He drank water because eating suddenly felt impossible. Potter entered several minutes later. Draco saw him immediately. Harry did not look toward the Slytherin table. That was deliberate. He sat with Weasley and Granger. Granger spoke. Harry answered. Weasley glanced once toward Draco. Then all three bent over something on the table. A map, perhaps. Parchment. Notes. Draco could not see. Pansy said something about Slughorn. He missed it. What? I said Slughorn wants the essay by Friday. Fine. You haven't heard a word. I heard Friday. Pansy gave him a suspicious look. Draco pushed the goblet away. He could not stay. Harry had done exactly what Draco feared. He had stopped needing to watch constantly. Observation had become preparation. Draco left the Great Hall through the side entrance. This time he went directly to the 7th floor. No detours, no false classrooms, no lookouts, no markers. The corridor outside the tapestry was empty. He stood opposite the blank wall. His heartbeat felt too fast. He began walking. I need the place where everything is hidden. Once, turn, again. I need the place where everything is hidden. Second pass, he pivoted. Third, I need the place where everything is hidden. A door appeared. Draco opened it and entered. The room of hidden things swallowed him among its towers of junk. He shut the door. Then he did something he had never done before. He began destroying his system. The brass scale came first. He took it from inside the vanishing cabinet and carried it far from the repair site, past heaps of furniture and stacked cages, until he found a mound of tarnished metal objects. He buried the scale beneath 3 dented cauldrons and an iron stand. The chipped teacup went next. Different aisle, different heap. He snapped the broken green quill into smaller pieces and scattered them among old papers. Every scrap of parchment he had used for measurements went into his pocket for disposal elsewhere. He moved the chair, the crate, the candlestick, anything he remembered checking habitually. He even shifted the route he used between the entrance and the cabinet, climbing over a broken desk and squeezing between 2 wardrobes, rather than following the path he had worn into the dust. Halfway there, he stopped. A shallow line crossed the floor ahead. His old route. Visible, not because someone had marked it, because he had. Hundreds of footsteps. Same approach, same turns, same destination. Draco stared at the worn trail. He had spent weeks worrying about objects. The floor had been telling the story all along. His throat tightened. He crouched beside the path and dragged a broken table leg across it. Dust spread over the shoe marks. Not enough. He found an old broom without bristles and used the wooden shaft to rake the surface. Gray powder clouded his trouser legs. He kept going, 10 feet, 20, 30. Erase, scatter, cross, make false paths. He worked until sweat gathered beneath his hair and his wrists ached. When he finally reached the vanishing cabinet, the route behind him no longer ran cleanly through the room. It branched, looped, stopped, crossed itself. Better. Not safe. Better. Draco stood before the cabinet and examined the tools he had left nearby. 2 organized. He moved those 2. 1 file beneath a desk. A cloth inside a cracked trunk. A screwdriver-like muggle tool farther away beside a broken chair. He hated losing efficiency. Efficiency had almost exposed him. A sound reached him from the entrance side of the room. Very faint. A knock. Draco went rigid. Another knock. Not from inside, from beyond the hidden door. Someone was testing the wall. He did not move toward it. The knock came a 3rd time. Then silence. Potter. Maybe. It no longer mattered. Someone had reached the correct stretch of corridor. Draco looked at the vanishing cabinet. The repair was incomplete. Snape had withdrawn his cover. Crabbe and Goyle were unusable. Potter had narrowed the location. The old system was gone. Everything that had made the work manageable had been stripped away by Draco himself. He reached into his robes and found nothing but his wand. Good. He removed the last folded cabinet note from an inner pocket. The parchment contained weeks of measurements. He read it once, then tore it down the middle, again. The pieces became too small to reconstruct easily. Draco carried them to an old metal brazier, touched his wand to the pile, and used a simple flame to burn them. The parchment curled black at the edges. Numbers vanished. Measurements vanished. His shortcuts vanished. When the final scrap collapsed into ash, Draco ground it beneath his heel. Beyond the hidden door, someone struck the wall once more. Draco turned away from the sound. He had no markers left, no written notes, no lookouts, no route he could trust twice. He crossed the altered floor toward the vanishing cabinet and placed both hands on its doors. From now on, every entry would have to be made fresh, and every mistake would belong only to him. The 7th floor corridor looked ordinary enough to betray anyone who trusted appearances. Draco stood near the window, at the far end with an unopened book tucked beneath his arm, and watched students pass the tapestry without giving it a second glance. He had chosen the position because it offered 3 reflections at once: the window glass, the polished brass edge of a torch bracket, and the framed surface of an old landscape painting whose river had gone silver with age. He did not need any of them for markers. He needed them only to see who believed he was still the same boy who had spent weeks leaving trails behind him. Potter arrived alone. That surprised Draco. No Weasley lumbering several steps behind. No Granger pretending to inspect a timetable while remembering every doorway she passed. Harry came from the western staircase carrying his bag over one shoulder and slowed when he saw Draco near the window. The hesitation lasted barely long enough to notice, but Draco caught it. Potter had expected him here. Draco opened the book. He read nothing. Harry walked past without speaking. 3 paces later, Draco closed the book and headed in the opposite direction. Potter stopped. That was the first exchange. Draco descended 1 flight, cut through the gallery below, and returned to the 7th floor by the eastern staircase. He had done nothing secret. He had gone nowhere useful. Yet when he emerged near the tapestry again, Potter was standing beside a suit of armor studying a notice pinned to the wall. Too obvious. Draco let out a quiet breath through his nose. Potter, Harry looked over. Malfoy. Still fascinated by notices? Some of them. Draco shifted the book beneath his arm. Try reading one eventually. Harry's eyes dropped to the book. Draco saw the calculation happen. Object, root, pattern. Exactly what Harry had been trained to expect. Draco continued down the corridor. The book was worthless. He had taken it from the common room solely because Potter had spent weeks learning that Draco carried things when he intended to go somewhere secret. Second exchange. At the next corner, Draco handed the book to a passing second-year Slytherin. The boy nearly dropped it. Take that downstairs. Where? I don't care. The student hugged the volume to his chest and hurried away. Draco turned back. Harry had followed far enough to see. His gaze went after the boy. There, a choice. Draco almost admired how quickly Potter resisted it. Harry remained where he was. Better. If the first trick had worked, Draco would have learned nothing. He returned toward the tapestry and walked straight past Harry. Lost your book? Harry asked. Lost interest. You usually keep hold of things. Draco stopped. That sentence confirmed more than Harry intended. He looked sideways at him. You usually keep hold of other people's property. Harry's expression sharpened. The sickle? Draco smiled faintly. So you admit taking it. It was lying in an empty classroom. And that makes it yours? It was bait. Draco's face stayed still. Potter had reached the correct conclusion. Late, but correctly. Harry stepped closer, lowering his voice as 2 Ravenclaws passed between them. You wanted me to find it? Congratulations. Why? To see if you were stupid enough to pick it up. Harry's jaw tightened. Draco walked away before he could answer. 3rd exchange. This time Harry did not follow immediately. That mattered. Draco reached the turn beside the tapestry, then kept moving until he disappeared from Harry's sight. He stopped there and waited. 5 seconds. 10. Footsteps. Harry came after him. Good. Draco entered a narrow side passage that ended near a classroom seldom used except for storage. The stones were colder there, and the corridor carried the unpleasant smell of dust mixed with mouse droppings. He put one hand against the classroom latch. Harry appeared at the entrance. Draco opened the door. Harry accelerated. Draco went inside. The room contained broken stools, 2 cracked blackboards, and a stack of desks missing legs. Nothing else. Draco moved to the far wall and crouched beside a low cabinet. Harry entered. "Looking for another storeroom?" he asked. Draco pulled open the cabinet. Empty. He shut it again. "Looking for privacy." Harry glanced around. "You've got plenty." "Not anymore." Draco stood. Harry's hand hovered near his wand. Draco noticed but did not reach for his own. A duel would ruin everything. More importantly, Potter expected one. Draco moved toward the door instead. Harry blocked it. Fourth exchange. "What are you doing?" Potter asked. "Trying to leave?" "Not that." Draco looked at him. "Everything?" There it was. The question Harry had been building toward for weeks. Not proof, not knowledge, a demand. Draco tilted his head. "You've spent enough time following me. Work it out." "I have." "No, you haven't. You're a Death Eater." The words landed quietly. No thunder, no dramatic shock. Just Potter saying aloud what Draco had expected him to say since the beginning of term. Draco felt the dark mark beneath his sleeve, like a bruise he had stopped noticing until touched. He kept his face contemptuous. "Is that your great discovery?" Harry's eyes stayed on him. "You've got something planned." "Everyone has something planned." "You're involved with Katie." Draco's throat tightened. He stepped forward. Harry did not move. The space between them narrowed to less than an arm's length. "Careful, Potter." Harry's voice dropped further. "You nearly killed her?" The words hit harder than Draco wanted them to. Katie suspended above the road. The necklace, Rosmerta. The stupid distance between intention and result. He pushed the image aside. "Prove it." Harry stared at him. Draco held the stare. That was still the advantage. Potter knew. Potter could not prove. And Draco could use certainty without evidence more easily than ignorance. He stepped around Harry. This time Potter let him pass. Draco left the classroom and moved toward the main corridor. Harry followed again. Good. Now the real operation began. Draco took the northern staircase, then the corridor toward the library, then down again. No hidden route, no destination, just repetition shaped to resemble the habits Harry had already learned. Potter stayed behind him. Draco reached a junction and stopped beside a door marked with an old brass number. He looked at it, only once, then continued. Behind him, Harry slowed. Draco did not check. He already knew what would happen. Potter had spent weeks learning that Draco's smallest glance could matter. Now Draco gave him one deliberately. The door led to nothing but a disused classroom. At the next landing, Draco passed a narrow alcove and adjusted his left sleeve. Another signal? Potter noticed. At the following stair, Draco touched the stone banister with 2 fingers. Another. Meaningless. He was building a route out of Harry's expectations. By the time Draco reached the corridor below the 7th floor, Potter had stopped merely following. He was predicting exactly what Draco needed. Someone waited near the foot of the stairs. Snape, of course. Draco nearly laughed. The professor's presence would have ruined the plan 2 weeks ago. Now it improved it. Snape looked first at Draco, then at Harry several yards behind. Mr. Malfoy. Professor. Potter. Harry stopped. Snape's expression settled into familiar displeasure. Is there a reason the two of you are wandering the castle instead of attending to your studies? Draco answered first. Potter's developed a hobby. Harry glared at him. He's hiding something. An accusation without evidence, Snape said, is merely noise. Harry looked furious. Draco felt a small, sharp satisfaction. Snape turned toward him. And you? I was going to the library. That is not the direction of the library. Draco shrugged. Changed my mind. Snape's eyes narrowed. The professor knew that was false. The question was how much more he knew. Your behavior has become increasingly tiresome, Snape said. Draco stepped nearer. Harry could still hear them. Perfect. Snape lowered his voice, but not enough. You rejected assistance. You insisted upon secrecy. You have since attracted exactly the attention I warned you about. Draco looked past him toward Potter. Harry was listening, every word. This was dangerous, also useful. Snape continued. If you expect me to intervene now, I don't. Then stop behaving as though someone else will clean up the consequences. Draco's fingers curled once against his palm. He forced them open. Snape was speaking about the mission. Harry would hear something else. That difference mattered. Draco leaned slightly closer to Snape. You have no idea. The words came quietly. Snape's face changed. Not much. Enough. Harry heard them too. Draco saw it. To Snape, the sentence meant, you do not know how far this has gone, what I have risked, what I have built, what Voldemort will do if I fail. To Harry, it meant, you have not found the secret yet. Both interpretations were true. Neither contained the truth Draco needed to protect. Snape stared at him for another moment, then stepped aside. Go. Draco walked past. Harry hesitated. That was the opening. Draco turned left. Harry followed, just as Draco expected. They climbed. One floor, then another. At the 7th floor landing, Draco slowed. The tapestry lay ahead. Harry's breathing changed behind him. Barely audible. Enough. Draco approached the section of wall opposite Barnabas the Barmy. Then he did not stop. He continued 20 paces beyond it. At the far end stood an abandoned classroom door. Draco touched the handle. Harry halted behind him. Draco looked over his shoulder. Coming? Harry's suspicion deepened. Draco opened the door. Inside lay desks, broken stools, an old lectern, and nothing of value. Harry stared past him. Draco stepped in. Harry remained outside. Good. Draco walked to the rear of the room and deliberately shifted one desk. Wood scraped stone. Harry entered. Draco moved a second desk, then a third. What are you doing? Harry asked. Draco ignored him. He crouched near the wall and inspected the floor. Nothing. Harry came farther inside. The trap required no spell, no locked door, no danger, only certainty. Draco stood and looked annoyed. Wrong room. Harry stared. What? You heard me. Draco walked past him. Harry grabbed his arm. Draco twisted free. Get off! You came straight here. And? You were looking for something? Yes. What? Draco gave him a look of exaggerated disbelief. My missing dignity, Potter? Clearly wasted effort? Harry's frustration showed now. That was the consequence Draco wanted. Not confusion, commitment. Potter had chosen this room. The false route was no longer Draco's. It belonged to Harry. Draco left. He moved quickly but not hurriedly toward the stairs. Harry stayed behind, searching. Excellent. Draco descended one flight, then another. At the next landing, he changed direction and used a different staircase to return upward. No markers, no pauses, no repeated objects. His hands stayed empty. His pace remained ordinary. When he reached the 7th floor again from the opposite side, the corridor outside the tapestry was deserted. Potter was still inside the false classroom. Draco approached the blank wall. No one followed. He passed the required stretch once. I need the place where everything is hidden. Turn, second pass. No footsteps. I need the place where everything is hidden. Again. Third, I need the place where everything is hidden. The door appeared. Draco opened it and slipped inside. The room of hidden things stretched before him. He did not take the old path. There was no old path anymore. He crossed over a mound of broken chairs, passed beneath a hanging tapestry stiff with dust, stepped around a cracked harp, and chose turns as they came, rather than following anything memorized. The vanishing cabinet eventually emerged between two heaps of forgotten furniture. Draco reached it alone. No Crabbe, no Goyle, no Snape, no Potter. He opened one door. The warped hinge complained. He reached inside and ran his fingertips along the repaired fittings. Work remained. Plenty. But the secret had held. Draco removed his wand and began. Far away beyond walls Harry could not open because he did not know what to ask them for. A false classroom waited full of meaningless desks. Draco tightened one fitting inside the cabinet. The metal seated properly. He tested it once. Solid. Then he closed the cabinet door, selected the next damaged piece, and continued the repair. Outside, Potter had finally found exactly what Draco wanted him to find. Nothing.